Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of Right Reason with Dr. Charles Rice, the law school professor emeritus at Law School at Notre Dame, who's obviously the star of the show here.
Right.
Dr. Rice has, if you've watched the show before, you've seen that Dr. Rice has graciously agreed to come on and be the guy who helps guide our thinking and our reasoning and everything else in the Catholic tradition. Catholic educational tradition. So last week, this is sort of part two of a show. We don't generally do part one, part twos, but this is a part two. We were talking about the spiritual faculties of intellect and free will. Now last week, we talked about the intellect, and if you didn't see the show, we'll go on the website there, click around and find last week's show on the intellect. This week, we're going to talk about free will, and exactly what does that mean? There's a whole host of questions that come out of are we really free? All of these kinds of things. So we want to talk about free will right now. So, Doctor, when we talk about, first of all, just sort of the Catholic tradition, when we talk about free will, what are we talking about? Is it just the ability to choose? I can choose bad or choose good, or I can drink water or Coke, and that's it? Is that all we mean by free will?
Well, you're not free in everything you do, first of all. I mean, obviously, if you're going to sign up for medical school, once you make that decision to sign up for medical school, you're no longer truly free to decide whether to go to class or not. I mean, within the context of that overall decision, you got to do it. You're not really free to decide to drive on the left-hand side of the road or to ignore red lights, that kind of thing. You are in a sense, but
you have the ability, but
there's a compulsion operating, and there are two errors that John Paul and Benedict XVI have pointed out, and one of them is the idea that we're free to do anything, and again, relativism, and that freedom has no relation, and will has no relation to the truth, and the other is that we're not free to do anything. That everything is compulsion, and that we're really not free. And
I was going to say, it's interesting as you kind of look over the landscape of contemporary man and modern culture, that you have these these two extremes. They both lead to sort of the same end. It's just kind of a collision course with our own nature, but that a society can maintain, on the one hand, there's no freedom,
right,
and on the other hand, have just as viable an opinion that there's total freedom,
right.
And you can have both of these existing, and yet both of these errors result in the exact same, they have the same consequences, which is man becomes less free in the end at the end of the day.
Yeah, there are two things we ought to talk about. One is the relation between freedom and truth, right? But the first thing is, let's get into the question of, are you really free? Do you really have free will? How do you know?
Yeah.
How do you know you have free will? Are you free in anything? You're free to make a choice in anything. And the best way to look at it is to look at a situation before you make a decision, while you're doing the thing you've decided on, and then afterwards. All right? And if you're deciding, for example, to go to law school, deciding whether to go to law school, and you're in college, and you want to decide, what am I going to do with my life? When you're trying to make up your mind that you can go to law school or you can't.
Right.
That it's up to you.
Yeah, you're free to or free not to.
You are. Yeah. I mean, that nobody's got a gun to my head making me decide to go to law school. Then, while you're doing it, you decide to go to law school. While you're doing it, and you decide this is boring stuff. At that point, you got yourself into this, all right? And then afterwards, the question comes up, have you ever regretted anything? Sure. Why did I ever do that? What was I thinking of when I did this or did that?
Yeah.
I mean, these are simple psychological, in a sense, proofs that, yeah, we are free. We're not free in everything.
Right.
All right, and not everything we do we're free. I mean, you're not free to decide not to pay your income taxes. All right, yeah, you are in a sense if you're willing to accept the penalty, but there's a compulsion on you.
Sure.
Pay your taxes and so on. So there is that reality of the freedom of the will.
Mm-hmm.
But what John Paul in Veritatis Splendor emphasized, and what Benedict has emphasized also,
Mm-hmm.
is that freedom has to be related to the truth.
Right.
You know, that
Which means what? I mean, that's a nice phrase. What does that mean?
it gets us back to what we were talking about before in terms of nature
Mm-hmm.
and the natural law and so on. And to go back to the car example,
Mm-hmm.
you know, you're free to decide to put water in your gas tank.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, you have that freedom,
Mm-hmm.
but you're no longer free to drive your car,
Right.
because freedom is not simply the ability to do whatever we want. Freedom is the ability to do what we ought
Ah,
to
see.
do. Right?
And that's something that is not grasped
That's correct.
by, in general, the contemporary culture.
Because if you violate your nature, if you violate, and your nature is a spiritual nature,
Mm-hmm.
all right?
Mm-hmm.
If you violate your nature, you're going to become a slave.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to lose that freedom.
Right.
Just as you're going.
Like an example, you're free to drink. You're free to drink yourself blind every night.
Sure.
But eventually, you're not going to be free to stop doing that.
That's correct. And you're going to actually deprive the community of what you should be, what
Mm-hmm.
you could be. And if you're you know, talking about the you know, example of the car and that kind of thing, hey, I made that free choice to put water in my gas tank.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I've got to walk every place now, right? Because
Exactly.
I can't drive the car,
Right.
right? So there's a relation there between freedom and the truth. And the point that John Paul was making in Veritatis Splendor and that Benedict has made is that there's a loss of the sense of the reality of moral truth,
Mm-hmm.
right? And
Mm-hmm.
it's a dictatorship of relativism. So that your you know, your free will, you're free to make choices. Not right, don't claim that you're free in everything you do, but you're free to make choices. But that freedom is not a liberation from the reality of your nature.
Right.
And the reality of God's law and the natural law.
And so when the church makes a comment, offers a teaching, like you are not free to commit this sin, it doesn't mean you don't have the ability to do it. Of course you have the ability to do it.
Right.
You can physically pick up the gun and kill the man, but to do so violates the truth of what you are, which is not somebody who's supposed to bring death, but bring life.
Right.
So how have things gotten mixed up here? Some people will say, yeah, I'm a hired gun for the mafia. Bang, that's what I do, and I'm free to live this life, and I'm free to choose this profession, and that's what I do. Why is that wrong?
Well,
Why is his choice to do that wrong?
because it's contrary to his nature.
Okay.
All right, and it's contrary to the natural law, and the author of the natural law is God, the Creator. Just like the author of the law of your Chevy is General Motors, Obama Motors. Right? The maker of the entity puts the law into that entity of its nature.
So I think that's an important point, that inherent in the nature of everything is kind of a subset, if you want to think of it that way. A subset of that nature is that this thing must behave a certain way. It must do things.
If it's going to achieve its end.
If it's going to achieve its end.
It's going to achieve its end. Now, you can decide, you got a car, all right?
Mm-hmm.
And you can decide that you're going to, you want to see a big splash, so you're going to drive that car off the dock into the water and you'll never see it again.
And you're free to make that decision.
And you're not acting, you're not even trying to use the car in the way it's supposed to be used, all right?
Right.
But if you want that car to behave in the way its maker made it to behave,
mm-hmm.
you got to obey its laws.
Right.
And you got to put oil instead of molasses in the crankcase, and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But you can use it. I mean, heck, you can decide to make a bonfire out of your car.
Sure.
All right. That's and say, well, that's what I'm using it for. That's your choice. But
so the question on freedom doesn't really come down to the ability. Which I think that's particularly in kind of the Western or more American mindset. It's like, I'm free to do that, meaning kind of like I can do that if I want to, sort of thing. But again, there's no relation to the idea of, wait a minute, you have the freedom to do this because it must correspond to the way something must be done, and as John Paul would say, it has to correspond to the truth.
Yeah, the truth though is actually the truth of your nature, and you wonder, you say, well, why have things gotten so goofed up? You know? And
why have they gotten so goofed up?
Well, I think it goes back. It goes back to the philosophical problems, the Descartes and all the rest of that.
Mm-hmm.
The reason can't know anything beyond, beyond the empirical.
Mm-hmm.
It also goes back to the Reformation.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you think about it, and again, this is a point that the recent popes have made. If you think about it, the Reformation was the denial of the authority of the papacy,
mm-hmm.
right? And that had catastrophic effects.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Pope Benedict, when he was Cardinal Ratzinger, right, gave an address to the American bishops. All the American bishops were gathered in Dallas in 1991.
Mm-hmm.
And he gave an address on conscience, right? And he talked about Newman's famous quote where Newman said that,
mm-hmm.
I don't think religion should be brought into after-dinner toasts, but if I had to, I would drink to the Pope, but to conscience first.
Yes.
Right? You say, well, what did Ratzinger and now Benedict say about that? He agreed with it.
Mm-hmm.
All right? He agreed with it. And he said, if it were not for conscience, you wouldn't need the papacy. Well, what does that have to do with human nature and all that? And he made a very interesting explanation. They gave a very interesting explanation of this. He talked about conscience in two respects. One is conscience as the act,
mm-hmm.
as Thomas says, is the act by which we judge the rightness or wrongness of a moral action.
Mm-hmm.
All right? So it's a judgment.
Again, the presupposition that there is a rightness or wrongness.
That we judge the rightness or wrongness. But then he talked about it in terms of what he called anamnesis.
Yeah.
All right?
Mm-hmm.
Which corresponds kind of to Aquinas's synderesis, which is the moral equipment that you have to make moral decisions. But he said anamnesis is a more precise term. It's what is amnesia? Amnesia is forgetfulness.
Mm-hmm.
An is the negative.
Right.
Anamnesis is a remembrance.
Right.
All right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's a fascinating thing. 1991, you can get it on Google or whatever.
Sure.
He said the anamnesis is kind of a memory that we have of the way things were before the fall.
Before the fall, right.
All right? And it's the kind of thing that leads somebody to look at a statement and say, that's it, that's true. And the purpose of the papacy, he said, is to recall to people that truth of the way things ought to be. The papacy, we look at authority today as in a liberal, like the political liberals, that the only kind of authority is an oppressive exterior, external force compelling you to do something contrary to your freedom. And
Right.
he said, no, he said, authority is a help to conscience.
Sure.
It's a help to freedom. And he said, what it is the awakening, the reminding of the person of the way things ought to be, you know?
It's fantastic. Whenever we realized when he said that, well, of course he didn't realize that. 20 years later, he'd be the Pope.
I know. Yeah. But it's a fascinating thing.
It is. I've actually heard that of him before, and a number of people have actually picked that up and developed it as a thought. But let's take a break when we come back. But I do want to talk about when we come back. I think what's helpful is to say, okay, so when we choose something wrong,
right,
we limit our freedom and eventually lose it. Why, we'll talk about when we come back. Why is that? That doesn't seem right as you hear it, but when you think about it, it is.
Yeah,
so
let's get into it.
We'll be right back right after this.
Yeah.
Well, everyone, welcome back to Right Reason here with Dr. Charles Rice. We're just talking off camera, and we're not even sure half the time when the camera's on or not because these conversations are so cool. Let's talk about the free will. Now it is an absolute position, of the church teaching that the more you use your free will incorrectly and keep choosing the wrong, the less and less and less freedom you have until eventually you have no freedom, or essentially no freedom practically to speak of. Right. How is that? What does that mean exactly?
It can work in both directions, and St. Thomas goes into that. It can work in both directions in the sense that virtue sharpens the intellect and sharpens our ability to recognize good.
Meaning,
right?
What does that mean?
It because you're acting in accord with your nature, and you're moving in accord with that nature, and you everything is working together.
Right. You have integrity.
You have a
Everything's
better
integral. Right.
The more you act in accord with virtue, which is strength, the more your ability exists to practice virtue. And on the contrary, St. Thomas is very emphatic that habitual vice can darken the intellect, so that you find people who have put themselves into a position where they no longer really are thinking about what they're doing being wrong, and we can't judge. I mean, we're not Deputy God Almighty. We can't ultimately decide what is going on in terms of somebody's internal dispositions, but that is true. That when you get into a habit of choosing the wrong, it affects your intellect as well as your will, and it forms a habit of doing the wrong thing.
As we, here's a practical example of this. It actually popped in my head because I saw something. I was flicking around the TV the other night. There was a young lady, middle-aged lady, who was reflecting on her life and saying that no matter what happened, she simply could not find the right guy. And every single guy she went on a date with, she said, not only, what's wrong with me? Why do I? What's got the? And what she wanted, she said this in a little interview, whatever it was she was talking about. She says in this interview, all I wanted was just to be, a good mom, a good wife, have a nice, and the more I chose these bad guys, the less and less I got that until the end. Here, I think she said 43, 44, and I don't have any of it, and that's yet it's weird because that's what I set out to get, and now I've limited myself, and now who wants some mid-40-year-old single woman who has nothing really to offer? And I thought, wow, what a horrible, sad state of affairs for her, and a sad commentary on things. But all of the culture, all of the society has told her, go out and choose what you want, do what you want, choose this, choose that. It doesn't matter, and do whatever you want. You total freedom, total. And every time she made a bad choice, she necessarily limited herself the next time. And there's that old saying that when you sit down to play a game of chess, and before anybody's made a move, the possibilities are virtually infinite. But the moment you make the first move, all future moves are contained in that move. And you become limited from there on out. You become limited to the point where you eventually are checkmated, and if you've made the wrong moves. And I think that's a very cool analogy.
Yeah, subject to the fact that you could always, the grace operates, and you can always...
and there's the redeeming thing that we come back to now. You've gone down this road, you've made these horrible choices, blah, 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 blah. And then there's grace.
And you still have the freedom. You may have damaged it, but you still have the freedom to make that choice.
And how does grace work on a person who has greatly narrowed their freedom?
Moral miracles.
What is that? What does that mean? I think people need to hear that.
Yeah, I think it is. It's a kind of thing where you say, well, man, just in terms of human factors, this guy's a loser. This is over.
Big L.
This is over. I mean, there can be, miraculous changes in people. Sure. It's never too late to choose, because we do have the freedom of the will. And the important point that you find in Veritatis Splendor especially is that freedom has to be connected to the truth.
Right.
All right? And you're really not free. You're a slave to evil and so on if you choose against the truth.
Yeah.
But the freedom has to be connected to the truth. It's just in simple things. I mean, it's like the car, you're no longer free to drive the car if you violate the nature of that.
I think there may be, speaking of the anamnesis, that kind of that touch back to, we have some recollection of the good, the right, the correct, from before original sin, when our natures were, in that state. I think it's one of the reasons maybe the prodigal son parable of our Lord has such a resonance with people, because there is it's sort of the whole panoply of the human experience is there.
Right.
Here's a guy who, what does he do? He wants what he wants. Give me my stuff, disregarding his father. Give me what I want. I want to freely choose whatever I want to do. And he takes his money, he scoots off to wherever he scoots off to, and he spends it on like how any young guy's going to spend his money: parties, friends, drinking, carrying on. I mean, the older brother tells us, I don't know how he knew, but the older brother tells us he's all spending your money on loose women and everything else. But what happens? The man has the son has this intellectual boom, because the more he's lived the way he wants to, the more and more and more narrow his life has become, until what happens? He's finally sitting there wanting to eat what the pigs on the pig farm are eating. And then he wakes up, and there comes grace. And it says, and I think it's very, very cool, the way our Lord says it, more than cool, obviously, it was a colloquial. Jesus is cool. Is when he says, and at last he came to his senses.
Right.
He had disregarded the intellect. He had made the horrible choices based on something other than the truth.
Right.
But when he comes to the truth, now he's able to climb back up out of this, and he makes his decision and he goes.
Yeah.
And is that not the story of human life?
Yeah, it's the line in that parable that I think is so powerful is, his father saw him when he was far away.
Far away.
All right?
Yeah.
He was looking for him. And you can't abstract these things from the reality of God and the reality of our nature. And so we say, well, yeah, you have freedom of the will because before you do something, you can choose it while you're doing it. And afterwards, you could say, why did I ever do that? But there's much more to it. It's the relation between freedom and truth. And if you reject that, if you ignore that, you're going to diminish yourself. And they say, well, why is it that, as St. Thomas says, repeated vice can darken the intellect? Because you diminish yourself. You cut yourself off from the truth. And in that address by Cardinal Ratzinger back in 1991 to the American bishops, he started out by recounting what he had heard somebody say, that for all we know, maybe Hitler and Stalin are saints, and Adolf Eichmann and so on, because they really thought that they were doing the right thing. If they really thought that they were doing the right thing, they're saints. And then he got into that discussion of anamnesis, and he said, well, ultimately, of course, only God is the ultimate judge, all right? And we're not Deputy God Almighty. But what he said was that it seems clear that what they did was ignore, reject the anamnesis of their being. They rejected that inclination to seek the good, informing their conscience. And so we have free will. Yeah, we have free will, and we're our freedom really has to be connected to the truth. And what is truth? All right? I mean, truth is in a basic sense, truth is the correspondence of the expression to reality. All right? That is a sweater. That's true. All right? That's true. But truth in the more basic sense is a person. It's Christ. And that's where you get into the whole question of freedom of the will and the operation of grace. Is such a great benefit to have the church, as Cardinal Ratzinger said back then in 1991, to remind us of what our nature is.
So we've only got a couple of minutes left, and let's talk about So forget the culture at large. I mean, the culture at large has always been sort of the object of evangelization. Go out and save the world, baptize all nations. I mean, that's always been the case. But something has gone sort of wrong inside the church, where this kind of discussion sounds novel and new, and yet up until a couple generations ago, this was standard fare. And now it's just kind of, you don't even hear about it anymore. Oh, it was absolutely standard fare.
Yeah.
It was standard fare.
Hey, listen,
you talked about truth, you talked about freedom, you talked about morality, and there was a right and there was a wrong, and there are 10 Commandments enshrined some of this, and on and on. This was all part of just who you were, as this is how you lived, and this is how society stayed melded together, and you didn't have, millions of fatherless children, and, families falling apart, and sex coming out of your ears, and so it's probably a fair statement to say that as the church kind of, not the official church, but members of the church, sort of began abandoning this approach to truth, well, the world lost access to it.
That's correct.
And has fallen apart.
Yeah. And Cardinal Dolan referred to that when he was talking about the healthcare mandate, when he said that we have failed to teach the truth about contraception and so on. And the Catholic educational system has changed, obviously. I mean, I had the great advantage of grace of 11 years of Jesuit education. I learned this stuff in high school, and everybody did, just standard
what happened.
Stuff.
Yeah.
And we're getting back to it in some respects. The Catholic homeschool movement is very important here, and there are Catholic colleges that are doing an excellent job, particularly Franciscan University of Steubenville, Christendom,
Thomas
Aquinas, Thomas More in New Hampshire, and various places.
I got to put a plug in for my Aussie friends, Campion College in Sydney.
All right. Okay.
Another one. It's not just American.
Right. Okay. Yeah, but it's faith and reason.
Yeah.
You know, and we were talking before about the intellect. Now we're talking about the will. They go together. They affect each other.
Sure they do.
I mean, your intellect can affect what you choose, and obviously your will can affect what you do
think
in terms
about
of
Sure, absolutely.
So, but the connection between freedom and truth is so important, and that's what has been lost to a great extent today. That's why the magisterium is so crucial here.
Yeah.
That
you have to have access to the truth. You have to have it formulated properly, raised in it, understood it, be connected to it, see what it is, have it, and be able to discuss and ask questions. And it never ceases to boggle my mind when we're out on talks and making presentations wherever we are. We've never really heard any of this before.
Right.
Just if there was one comment, and you speak before crowds and write articles and get responses and everything. When you're kind of in this sort of work, you get public response.
Right.
And if there was one comment that I would say would sum up everything that in the thousands and thousands and thousands of responses that we've gotten here, it's I've never heard this before.
Anybody who's talking about this can relate to that experience.
Yeah. It's sad, but it's, to finish on a hopeful note here, it's also a great opportunity. It is a great opportunity to step into the breach and fight for the truth, fight for all of this to be brought back.
Oh yeah, and it's not. Hey, listen, it's not oppressive.
No.
Right?
What's oppressive? What's oppressive is the guy who's chosen to drink himself into oblivion. What's oppressive is the poor woman who's decided to go live with some guy in the secret hope in the back of her mind that one day she'll marry him, when 75% of the time they're going to wind up divorced or not married, divorced within 5 years. Yeah. That's what's oppressive. It's the denial of what you want as the good, and you're limiting yourself by choosing against it. That's oppressive.
Yeah. Well, this it gets us back to the natural law, right?
Absolutely.
And the whole thing, and the fact that there has to be an authoritative interpreter of that natural law in order for us to be truly free.
Absolutely.
In order for us to have the certainty of knowing that what we're choosing through our free will is actually the truth and is the good.
That's it. Right? We're getting the wrap, which means be quiet. That means me, because you can't see it.
Go back to the
telling
popcorn.
Me to be quiet.
Popcorn. Okay.
Dr. Charles Rice, Professor Emeritus, Notre Dame Law School, as always, a tremendous pleasure. These are great discussions, we think.
Yeah, it's kind of neat.
Kind of neat. And he loves the popcorn here.
Yeah, that's why I came.
Thanks, everybody else. Michael Voris, God bless.